In this video, I want to talk about retained primitive reflexes. So before we even start to talk about retained primitive reflexes, we kind of have to talk about what are the purposes of primitive reflexes. And it's really one and the same of the purpose we have for our sympathetic nervous system. So for both the primitive reflexes and sympathetic nervous system, it's all about survival and stress response. It's just a matter of when during our lives are we using this. So at all points of our lives, we should have access to the sympathetic nervous system. But for newborns, for infants, that's really where we see the primitive reflexes. And then over time, those should be what's called integrated into the system. And what that means is integrated. What that means is the prefrontal cortex, or the voluntary motor movements, should be able to take over that job for those reflexive or involuntary movements that the primitive reflexes allow babies to have. And so that way we can consciously protect ourselves when we're in survival mode. So the thing about being in survival mode and stress response mode, it can become a loop. So what we see, let's draw this out right here. What we see is if a baby gets stuck in survival mode or in stress response mode chronically, then that's when we start to see the retained primitive reflexes, and that's when we start to see really chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system. We call the sympathetic nervous system the gas pedal. That's when we start to see kids just stepping on the gas pedal all the time, which should not be the case. And so what this causes for parents, what you'll see is, chronic survival stress response mode. That's going to be where parents start to see extra sensitivity to noises, to lights, and different sensations. That's when, a heightened survival stress response mode, that also shows up in kids as increased anxiety or anxiousness over even the smallest things. So things that you as parents or adults, and even you see in other kids, they don't bother those kids, but the smallest things bother your child. That is a sign that they're in stress response. Their sympathetic nervous system's activated. They see everything as a threat, even if it's, a tag on their shirt, something's not quite right, put away, not quite right. And then another thing with being stuck in this loop of survival and stress response, that's going to decrease a child's emotional capacity. So we kind of talk about it in our office as emotional capacity is a cup, and we want our cup to be as empty as possible so that we have the most capacity for things to happen throughout the day, throughout the week, at school, at home for kids. So if a child's emotional capacity is decreased, their cup is already, say, 50% full or 80% full. And then if something happens that stresses their system, that means more water, more emotions get poured into the cup, and then over time, their cup overflows. And because it's already full at 50% or 80% or what have you, then it takes a lot less time for that child to really, be at their last wit's end. The straw to break the camel's back shows up so much earlier for children with decreased emotional capacity because their cup is already so full. And then another thing that comes with chronic survival stress response is an inability to cope with change. So what that means for a lot of parents, for children that we see, is they describe it as, they can't transition. The children they can't transition from one task to another, from getting in the car to getting out of the car to even getting in the car. Or, a lot of times for bedtime, it takes a lot longer than parents think it should, 30 minutes, 40 minutes just for a child to even get in the room, let alone to want to get in the bed, let alone to fall asleep. So this kind of cyclical pattern going from survival to stress response, causing even more primitive reflex integration problems or retained primitive reflexes, and also chronic and constant activation of the sympathetic nervous system. That is due to, right here, I'll put that right there, I'll just go down a little bit. That is due to, really, if we step back and think about what would cause that, an inability to adapt. So a child that is unable to adapt to whatever's going on around them or even within them, within their body, that creates that chronic stress response, chronic survival mode loop. And so let me just write that down. It causes a cycle of what's called sympathetic dominance that can actually mimic or cause retained primitive reflexes. So it can actually mimic or cause retained reflexes. So we see this in our office because so many kids are already doing so many therapies, which is awesome to try to integrate the primitive reflexes. But where there's a block for that child, they put in all the work, the hours with their therapist, they just can't get beyond, a certain point or a certain progress point. That's because their body and their nervous system is still stuck in this sympathetic nervous system stress response state that actually makes parents, the child, and the therapist believe that they still have primitive reflexes. But going back to what we originally talked about, what is the purpose of a primitive reflex? It's to survive and to activate its stress response. So once we get the nervous system out of that survival, out of that stress response mode, then that's really where we in our practice have started to see kids be able to get out of that loop. We break that loop of reflexes, sympathetic nervous system into stress mode and back again, repeat. Once we break that pattern, that neurological pattern, that's when kids really start to not only progress more with their other therapies, but that's also where we start to see a lot of things that parents tell us that are happening at home that they don't even know or think are connected to the work they've been doing. What I mean by that is digestive system, the immune system, the motor system, everything is connected to the body's ability to take the foot off the gas pedal, get out of that sympathetic dominant state so that it can actually rest and digest. So this right here, the inability to adapt, what it is called is subluxation. So subluxation has, let me get this out of the way, 3 components. And this is really important because this is how it ties into what we do as chiropractors at Sprout Family Chiropractic. So subluxation has 3 components, and as chiropractors, we correct subluxation. So let's break down the 3 components first before we talk about how we do that. So the first component is misalignment. And then, what does that mean? Vertebral misalignment in the neurospinal system. What can happen is physical stress, chemical, emotional stress can create misalignments in the spine, especially in the upper neck or upper cervical complex where we have the most movement, and that's where kids and babies are the most vulnerable to subluxation and misalignment. So that's the first component. And then what happens as a consequence, there's fixation. It could be fixation of that particular segment, could be fixation above and below because that misalignment creates altered motion, altered range of motion at a segmental and a global level. And then those first 2 components create the most critical component, the most impactful component of subluxation, which is neurointerference or imbalance. So this is called dysautonomia. So what dysautonomia is really a imbalance of the nervous system, and it's a shift from being balanced and regulated and adaptable and resilient to being stuck in a state that can no longer adapt. Remember, I just talked about the inability to adapt. That is dysautonomia. So the things that dysautonomia causes, not only the things that I talked about above with, sensory processing, anxiety, and all of that, but it really, really affects the physiological systems of the body, the motor tone, the immune system, the gut, emotional system, as I talked about above. And all of this is because there is an increase in sympathetic tone. So what we as chiropractors, as neurologically focused pediatric chiropractors do in our office is we remove this subluxation, we remove the misalignment, the fixation, we create or restore balance to the nervous system so that moving up, we no longer have this cycle. We actually have a break in the cycle where the body can still access a stress reaction or stress response, but it's no longer stuck in that pattern, which is extremely important. It needs to be able to not be stepping on the gas pedal, but be able to step on the brake pedal and say, hey, these are new skills that I want to integrate and I need to be allowed to integrate. So that's what we do at our practice. That's how chiropractic ties into primitive reflexes, the stress response, sympathetic dominance that we see in kids. So if you have any questions, please reach out to our office.